This is the Great War Discussion Group. The speaker for this afternoon is Dr. Alan Parmet, otherwise known as Owl to most of us. He is a physician, a public health doc, and an Air Force veteran. So, of course, he became interested in naval warfare and more specifically the torpedo. Al, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Charlie. We're going to talk about the torpedo and my favorite exhibit in the museum today. And you, of course, raise the question: what's an retired Air Force colonel doing talking about naval warfare? And the answer is really 65 years ago, I first visited Liberty Memorial. And when you walked in, the entire museum was the exhibit hall, and the first thing you saw, staring you at the face, was this torpedo. And I have been fascinated with it ever since. And at the end of this talk, we're going to come back and talk about our torpedo and exactly its own history as much as I've been able to discover. The torpedo, of course, is a naval weapon, and its use spans both sides of history before and after the Great War. We're going to talk about most of that, the modern innovations, and it's sort of fading away as a weapon compared to other guided devices. But its history is older than you might suspect. We actually go back to about 1800 when the inventor Robert Fulton named an underwater explosive device a torpedo after this torpedo ray. What he was talking about, we would call a naval mine today. And the explosions would be either by a timer or an electrical charge. And Fulton was quite an innovator. Bushnell had a bomb, which was actually a surface bomb that he would try to screw into boats and then later let them drift down the Hudson River, all unsuccessful, although it did, of course, make the British somewhat nervous. But Fulton proceeds to actually work on a device that can work, and he develops a submarine. It would have worked. It had an underwater cannon of some questionable use, but he also was going to tow his torpedo, and as he towed it past the target vessel, would detonate it electrically. Napoleon wasn't buying that, so Fulton went across the channel and tried to get the British to buy this. And his torpedo was actually towed by two rowboats with a cable between them and the bomb itself trailing behind. He demonstrated this in 1805 and literally blew a small vessel in half, demonstrating that it worked quite well. And the British Navy promptly wanted nothing to do with this because they totally dominated the sea at this point with their surface fleet, and they didn't want anything that might interfere with that. So Fulton became persona non grata with the British, and he ended up coming over to the United States where he did other good work, like steamboats. The first successful use of a torpedo will be during the American Civil War. At sea, it's asymmetrical warfare. The South really has very little in the way of naval capacity, so they look for other devices. They use torpedoes, which again we would call naval mines, with limited success. They do succeed in sinking the Tecumseh during the Battle of Mobile Bay, and Tecumseh was actually sailing intentionally into a minefield to protect the flagship. But unfortunately, she got close enough to where a mine was. And in those days, ships did not have watertight bulkheads. So a single hole below the waterline meant you were going to sink very rapidly. And the Tecumseh sinks in less than 2 minutes with most of her crew going down with her. The spar torpedo is also used. most famous is probably the CSS Hunley, succeeding in sinking the Housatonic and herself. And a number of these spar torpedoes are deployed by the South. Little success. They sink one boat, damage another, and sink about 7 of their own submarines. So that's not a great deal of success with that. The idea was to run up, spear your target, back off far enough, and trigger it, but that never quite worked. A naval lieutenant Cushing actually used a spar torpedo to sink a Confederate ironclad, the Albemarle, successfully, and amazingly got away with it. But the real key to these was the automotive torpedo, a self-propelled device. There are a number of people who come up with an idea for this. Most of them are what we would call surface runners, an idea which has come again, thank you to the Ukrainian Navy. These will be steered by boats or by ropes from shore. So they're mainly designed as harbor defense, a narrow spot where you knew the enemy would try to penetrate, and you would launch these small boats to ram the target and either set fire to it or blow it up. They're not nearly as stealthy, but they did have some directional control to them. In my investigation, none of them was ever used successfully, and the use, even the attempts, were pretty rare. However, a British engineer named Robert Whitehead develops an earlier idea by an Italian, and he calls it the automotive torpedo. He builds a gas-propelled engine in it. It has a compressed air container, and the compressed air turns a turbine, turns a single blade of the propeller, and will propel his torpedo underwater about 200 yards. So again, it's a harbor defense device. It has a fairly small warhead of about 8 pounds of gun cotton, which is nitrocellulose. Not in comparison to gunpowder, it's slightly more powerful, but only about 15% as powerful as the same mass of TNT. You would set your direction by setting the rudder and launching. They had strakes on the top of the bottom to try and counter the roll, because the single propeller would cause the torpedo to start rolling and spiraling, which of course doesn't do anything for your aim. Not very fast, but they were again proposed to sell these to the British Navy, who once again said, we don't want anything that's going to mess with our superiority. However, an inferior navy, Austria-Hungary, takes him up on this. And he is actually given an opportunity to set up a factory at Fiume, Austria, which is now Rioti in Croatia. The building is still there, although it's purposed for other things these days. And he goes into mass production. Whitehead will become fabulously wealthy, selling torpedoes to almost everybody except the Americans and the Germans. The Americans decide to go with a different power supply. It's called the Howell torpedo. Now, Lieutenant Howell of the U.S. Navy comes up with the idea of a flywheel. Spin it up using compressed air, and then launch it. And through a gearing mechanism and 2 propellers, he eliminates the roll, and he's able to maintain a continuous speed. It's considerably faster than the Whitehead torpedo. The range is larger, and he has a much larger warhead. So the U.S. Navy thinks this is far superior, and it works fine for harbor defense. The problem with the Howell torpedo is that the flywheel, which has to be spun up on the roll just as you're about to shoot it, that doesn't take too long, but the range is going to be absolutely limited. You can't get much more range out of this because there's only so large and so massive a wheel that you can put inside your torpedo. You can't make it longer and put more flywheels in. So Whitehead's torpedo becomes very popular, and soon Every Navy on Earth is starting to build a ship just to carry the torpedo. The very first torpedo boat mounting a single torpedo on the bow is HMS Lightning in 1877. The U.S. Navy follows with the USS Stiletto, which has a Howl torpedo in the bow. And then the French begin their Torpilliere, and the Japanese will copy that. These are usually mounting one, sometimes with a reload. And the result is that we have to develop a strategy to counter this. So the entire naval action is going to change because torpedo boats can now be present outside of harbors. And you want to be able to sink these little things or drive them off. So now large ships are going to carry smaller but rapid firing weapons. And other small ships will be built specifically to destroy the torpedoes, and they're called torpedo boat destroyers. And as long as you got a little torpedo boat destroyer, you put some torpedoes on it, and you have the modern destroyer. The first actual sinking by a torpedo comes in 1891 in the Chilean Civil War. The aiming capability of these early torpedoes is rather poor, and the launching vessel fired 6 torpedoes from 200 yards and only got 1 hit. But that was enough. Again, without watertight bulkheads in ships, you're going to go down very quickly. So everybody starts putting watertight bulkheads in so you can make very large unsinkable passenger liners like HMS Titanic. The Howl torpedo was as popular as it was with the U.S. Navy. They finally realized that it was limited and it wasn't really going to be useful at sea. So they contracted with Whitehead to license production by the Bliss Levitt Company of Brooklyn, New York. And they built 100 torpedoes. The problem with our construction was we did not have the technological capability to build a pressure vessel. Again, these are all running on compressed air. And we could not, in this country at that time, build a pressure vessel that would hold the pressurized air to run the torpedo. So they had to import the pressure vessel, which is basically the middle half of the whole torpedo. You have the front end is the warhead, and the rear end is the guidance and propulsion system. Mr. Whitehead is doing quite well. He's very wealthy. He marries an Austrian countess, has a number of children, and then grandchildren. One of his grandchildren marries the only son of Otto von Bismarck. And herein lies a story as to why Germany did not buy Whitehead torpedoes. Instead, Bismarck sends one of his engineers named Schwarzkopf. Something appropriate about that, because that means blackhead. And after visiting with Whitehead for about 2 weeks, Schwarzkopf goes home with the entire plans for a Whitehead torpedo. And the Schwarzkopf company begins manufacturing torpedoes in Germany on the Baltic coast. And he builds torpedoes out of bronze, so they don't rust, they don't corrode. Whitehead builds them out of steel, corrosion problems, but the Schwarzkopf torpedoes are about 3 times as expensive. So worldwide, Whitehead is still selling plenty of torpedoes. Now, the early Whitehead torpedo, again, had the pointy nose, a single propeller. Is my cursor showing up on there? I hope so. Early on, they discovered that a pointy nose to the torpedo actually slows it down and causes some instability. So by the mid-1890s, you're going to see blunt-nosed torpedoes coming in. That's why. Also, an American experimenting with this said, why have all those strakes? Let's put 2 propellers on, counter-rotating, and you eliminate that, and you eliminate the torque. A gyroscope is also placed. Begin putting in a heater for the compressed air, so that gives you more power. These are called hot runners. And now torpedoes, just before the war, can do 36 knots, considerably faster than any ship afloat. It's not till 1908 that we actually have a torpedo with a combustion engine in it. An alcohol burner, or as our Navy colleagues used to call it, torpedo juice, which could be drained and drunk, and often was. TNT is not invented until 1912, and so real firepower hits just before the Great War, and we have torpedoes with real killing power at this point. Everybody puts torpedoes on their ships. Virtually every warship afloat, from torpedo boats, torpedo boat destroyers, cruisers, and dreadnought battleships, will be equipped with torpedoes. You have the USS Whipple here, who is an early model torpedo boat destroyer. You know, it's mounting several 3-inch quick-firing cannon and 2 batteries of torpedoes. The other picture is the USS Idaho, a dreadnought battleship. And that projection from the side is the extension of the torpedo launcher. The battleships would typically have 2 torpedo flats, one forward and one aft, both below water, and oftentimes a single one forward, which kind of looks like a porthole right along the bow, but it's actually a launcher for torpedoes. The counter to this, however, of thought comes out of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. The French Navy was much larger than the very small and inexperienced Prussian Navy, which basically just sat in its harbor. But the French couldn't do anything about it because the British would not permit the French to attack German convoys traveling to England. That would get in the way of business. And the French were quite frustrated by this, and they didn't like putting the massive investment required to build battleships. And so what comes out of that is a new theory, because Mahan, of course, is postulating sea power, control of the sea, decisive battles. The French come up with a counter theory. It's called La Jeune École, the young school. And in this, they're going to have an asymmetrical warfare. This is a typical ship of the French Navy, the Marine Nationale. They have 8 small torpedo boats. Each torpedo boat is carrying 4 torpedoes. And the idea was your carrier would go out towards the enemy fleet, launch all the torpedo boats, who would raise havoc. You wouldn't have to make that huge investment in those expensive battleships. Instead, you could carry these very small, agile torpedo boats. The Japanese will also take up on this, and then the British, well, they got enough money, they're going to build one too. So, in essence, the British counter La Jeune École by having their own. And at this point, the British have a naval law requiring them to have a fleet as large as the next 2 navies, which in 1890 means France and Russia. But of course, Tirpitz and Wilhelm II changed that equation. And by the time of the Great War, Germany's number 2 and the United States is number 3. That also means Germany becomes a threat for England and France does not. Spanish-American War, we had opportunities to use the torpedo, but at Manila Bay, 2 of Dewey's ships never get close enough to launch their torpedoes. They've only got a range of a few hundred yards, so they're never close enough. They do try off of Cuba, but the one effort fails because the torpedo boat is badly damaged. Torpedoes first come into real combat with the Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese start the war by a surprise torpedo attack on the 1st Pacific Fleet anchored at Port Arthur. They fire 20 torpedoes at anchored stationary, essentially ships that are not on alert, and they get 3 hits, damaging 3 ships. because now these ships do have watertight bulkheads, and they're still firing the rather older, smaller warheads. The Japanese lay a lot of mines, and those will actually cause more damage. But the Russians are just terrified of these torpedo boat attacks. So when the Second Fleet is launched out of St. Petersburg, as they go through the North Sea, they encounter a British fishing fleet at night, and they assume it's Japanese torpedo boats. They open fire, managing to sink one fishing boat and badly damage one of their own cruisers. Ultimately, the Second Fleet will meet the Japanese at Tsushima. The engagement is decisively all by gunfire, but several Russian ships that are crippled and sinking are given the coup de grace by Japanese torpedo boats. Again, it's basically stationary targets. The other thing that's evolving at this time, however, is a submarine. Up to this time, submarines, they had the spar torpedo, they could have the so-called underwater cannon, but nothing is really going to make the submarine very effective until we actually have the torpedo. The USS Holland was equipped to carry one torpedo. And the plan is that the submarine will go along with the fleet, sneak in during a major battle, and torpedo the enemy warships. So the opposing admirals, in this case, in 1905, the admiral in charge of developing fleet tactics for the Royal Navy is Jellicoe. Tirpitz is in charge of the German Navy, and they both write the rules that when you're attacked by torpedoes, you will turn away. This becomes standard policy for avoiding torpedoes. And fleets will adhere to this, which means you now have a new tactic for driving off your enemy. Launch a few torpedoes so that they will turn away from you. When the Great War starts, Britain declares a blockade. So Germany declares a blockade. And the submarines are all told you have to go out with the fleet. However, Germany doesn't have any submarines capable of doing that. The British are building them, but they don't either. The Brits and the French actually have 5 times the number of submarines that Germany does. And Russia has a few as well. But the impact is immediate. In blockade, the rules were you had to blockade the enemy coast within sight of the coast. This proves to be disastrous for both sides. The U-21 makes the first kill of an enemy warship, and the U-21 is actually going to come back as the most successful submarine of the war. Then the British E-9 sinks a German cruiser, and then in September 22nd, the war is only 6 weeks old. On blockade duty are 3 old British armored cruisers, and the U-9 sinks all 3 of them in 2 hours. Clearly, a close blockade is suicidal. You just become a target. The same message to the Russians when the Russian cruiser Palada, that's my best pronunciation on that one, goes down. And at this point, you cannot detect a submarine. If it's submerged, it's undetectable, and it can't be attacked. There is no way to attack a submarine. Your only option is to shoot at it on the surface or ram it. The British, or as you heard in the museum, even come up with a plan that 2 guys are going to row a boat up and one's going to jump over, grab the enemy periscope, and break it with a hammer. Submarines aren't that slow. So the submarine submerged is invulnerable. It's not fast enough to catch the fleet. Therefore, it's much better as a commerce raider. And this leads to conflicts that will also ultimately bring the United States into the war. The London Declaration of Naval War in 1909 created rules for naval warfare so we could standardize these. This is where close blockade of within sight of the enemy coast was required. When stopping a merchant ship, you were required to stop them, identify yourself, inspect the cargo and passengers. You had to respect private property. You could confiscate contraband and the ship if it was carrying it. It actually only covered surface ships, so submarines aren't even mentioned. And nobody ratified it. Everybody signed it, nobody ratified it. So it's not technically binding. But at the start of the war, Woodrow Wilson insists that all the belligerents comply with this. He will continue to insist on this. And that, of course, with unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, will bring us into the war. The Germans opt on unrestricted submarine warfare for a couple reasons. They do initially try to practice cruiser rules. Merchant ships are supposed to be unarmed. They surface, direct their one small gun, usually anything from a 75 to a 105 millimeter gun. A merchant ship has to stop, identify itself, be boarded, inspected, and only then can the crew submarine decide whether it's actually contraband, and they can capture that ship and sink it. They can put a prize crew, but submarines usually don't carry a large enough crew to do that. There are a couple cases where it happened. The British decide to counter this with ships carrying concealed guns. They're based out of Queenstown, Ireland, so they acquire the term Q ships. They are standard merchant ships that are converted with drop-down concealed ports. They may carry as many as 6-inch weapons. The 4.7-inch naval rifle that we have in the museum is typical of what was put on the Q ships. They may also carry torpedoes, but they would pretend to be a merchant ship. They would stop. They would obey the submarine's directions to permit themselves to be boarded. They might even drop a lifeboat with a number of crewmen pretending to be evacuating the ship. And then when the submarine came into view close enough, they would give the word, drop the disguise, and blow the submarine out of the water. This made classical boarding just suicidal, because you couldn't tell if it was a Q ship or a legitimate merchant ship. It came to be identified in what are called the Barralong incidents. The HMS Barralong was a Q ship, and on 2 occasions, she responded to another merchant ship broadcasting that it was being stopped by a submarine. In the first case, the Barralong looked like she was coming to the rescue, stopped, pretended to be another merchant ship, and as the submarine came over to inspect her, they opened fire and sank it, and then shot at any German sailors that were in the water, resulting in the deaths of the entire crew. The first merchant ship reported this, and a month later, the Barralong did this again to an American merchant ship that was being inspected. There were several German crew members on the American merchant ship at the time that Barralong shows up and blows their submarine out of the water. The American ship refused to let the Barralong board her and transported the German survivors to Holland, where the treachery, if you will, this is a war crime, shooting sailors in the water, and that is what the Barralong did in both incidents. There were no consequences to the Barralong's commander or her crew. And so the Germans shifted to unrestricted submarine warfare, and that resulted in the sinking of the Lusitania and the Arabic, passenger ships, although the Lusitania was certainly carrying contraband. Woodrow Wilson was on his high horse, raised so much hell that the Germans agreed to withdraw from unrestricted submarine warfare in 1915, and they will stay away from that until 1917. A number of other campaigns are notable because the torpedoes are being widely used. In the Dardanelles, British submarines get in. They sink 2 Turkish pre-dreadnought battleships. The Germans sink 3 British pre-dreadnoughts plus two French ones transiting, and then a British seaplane barely getting off the water with a torpedo lands in the Sea of Marmara, taxis over to a Turkish ship, and torpedoes are there. The largest torpedo engagement in the whole First World War, and there were over 100 surface engagements with torpedoes used in many of them, but Jutland is the largest. It's not only the largest engagement, but literally hundreds of torpedoes are launched. There are mass attacks by British destroyer flotillas with a small cruiser accompanying them. The German flotillas launch them back. Somewhere between 400 and 500 torpedoes are launched by both sides. A total of 6 hits. But the critical one is when the British are crossing the T, and the Germans are able to use a battle turnaway and safely escape because all the torpedoes are launched en masse at the British line. They do hit the Marlborough, which will slow her down later, but doesn't do anything. And later that night, a British destroyer bumps into the German pre-dreadnought Palmer and puts a torpedo into her that hits her magazine, and she goes down with all hands. What we've discovered in the First World War is that when you hit somebody below the waterline, you get water in. Heavy shells don't usually sink a ship. There are very few instances of battleships sinking a battleship with shell fire. In fact, there are no battleships sunk by shell fire in the First World War. They're all mines and torpedoes. Battle cruisers are sunk by shell fire, along with some poor management. An example is the SMS Seydlitz at Jutland. She took 32 heavy caliber shells and 1 torpedo. The Lutzow sinks with only 24 hits, but the fatal hit actually hit her torpedo deck forward, and that was a very large compartment that flooded the forward portion of the ship, put her bow underwater, and she couldn't get over the sandbars to safely escape. In the Adriatic, we have the most successful torpedo officer in any war, Lieutenant Luigi Rizzo, in his torpedo boat MAS-15, which is on display in museum, sinks not 1 but 2 battleships all by himself. Drives up within about 500 yards and puts 2 torpedoes into the pre-battleship, the Wien, and then the San Esteban, which was a brand new dreadnought. And you've seen the San Esteban capsizing. That's the video in the naval warfare room. The guns are all pointed port because the torpedoes hit starboard and they were trying to counterbalance. It's only her 47th day in commission, and down she goes. Ultimately, the blockade by the Germans and the French against each other is going to decide the war. The Germans blockading England and in the Mediterranean, some numbers are as low as 11.5 million tons. The high number is 12.8 million tons, which is actually more than the Second World War. And they will sink over 5,000 ships, most of them merchant vessels. The average merchant vessel is much smaller and at the time of the Great War compared to World War II. So if you're just looking at ships, there are many more ships sunk by torpedo in the First World War. The British blockade simply causes hunger, lack of food, malnutrition, and loss of vital resources that prevent the Germans from carrying on. Ultimately, this is going to weaken them so much that they're going to have an armistice. They're defeated as much by the blockade as anything else. Submarines are not subject to attack until about 1917, when Jellicoe has actually invented the depth charge. He originally took a mine designed to sink a battleship and had them roll it off the back end of a cruiser. It almost sank the cruiser because it was far larger than what you needed to attack a submarine. If you're going after a 12,000-ton battleship, you need a lot more explosive than going after a 700-ton submarine. But by 1918, British destroyers are carrying depth charges, and if they chase a submarine underwater, they're able to attack it. But more important is the British go to a convoy system, and that reduces the ability of submarines to attack. They don't actually get very many submarines with depth charges. Most of the German submarines are killed by mines. That's the number one loss. Submarines are much more successful, and the number of aces, well, there aren't any British or French or Russian aces. There's a lot of German aces. The high score, 206 sinkings by Otto Steinbrink. That's unsurpassed. That is 6 times the high score from World War II. The high score for the Austrians is Georg von Trapp. Von Trapp's interesting because Whitehead's granddaughter, one of them married von Bismarck, and the other one is Agatha, and she marries Georg von Trapp. And of course, after the war, Austria has no seaport, and the von Trapps move up to this little place in the Austrian Alps where he raises his family, develops a singing group. Agatha unfortunately dies, so he marries his kid's nanny, and the rest is a Broadway musical. Interestingly, in my tour this week, I had a woman from Stowe, Vermont, so she did not know that story. Torpedoes become airborne. The Germans are successful in sinking several ships using seaplanes to carry torpedoes. And the great what-if question of the First World War is the Great Torpedo Raid. The British plan to attack Wilhelmshaven using air-launched torpedoes in October of 1918. And they had 165 Sopwith Cuckoos, 165 torpedoes. They just didn't have engines for the Cuckoos. It was going to take several months. So the attack was rescheduled for March 1919. Never happened. But what if? What if they'd pulled that off? Certainly the High Seas Fleet would not have been able to be given an order to sail out and attack in a suicidal fashion the combined American and British fleet, and they wouldn't have been given the opportunity to mutiny. So it's an interesting what if for the war. After the Great War, there's a lot of developments in torpedoes. Both the British and the Japanese will look at oxygen fuel instead of compressed air. Of course, oxygen is going to have 5 times the energy capability of compressed air, but it's a lot trickier to handle. And special piping was needed. If you put oxygen through a pipe that has oil in it, you'll have spontaneous combustion. And that's generally a bad thing next to a large amount of explosive, which is why the British eventually abandoned the oxygen-fueled torpedoes, but the Japanese will continue the development and successfully build the Type 93, which is a 24-inch torpedo with a range of 23,000 yards and a warhead of over 1,000 pounds of TNT. It's a real killer. The Germans and the U.S. will work on electric torpedoes. Magnetic triggers are a big thing. Everybody tries to develop them. The idea is a magnetic trigger allows you to drive the torpedo underneath a ship, like you see in the photograph. And as it passes under a ship, the the great mass of metal of that ship will trigger the explosion. And instead of much of the explosive power being vented upward when you strike the side of a ship, it all lifts the ship up and typically will break its back. So a single torpedo becomes lethal to even the largest warships. Germany and the United States developed them, and they are both, I think, disastrous is the best summary. When Germany starts the Second World War with their G7As, they don't work. They miss dozens and dozens of shots because the Germans have failed to figure out that the magnetic field in the Baltic Sea, where they've done all their testing, is not the same as the magnetic field in Norway or the North Sea. And it takes them almost a year and a half to figure this out. The United States does even worse because the Mark 14, with the same magnetic detonator, is tested off Rhode Island. It is never tested with a live warhead. This is what you see in the picture is a test shot, but there's no live warhead on it. So they never gauged whether the warhead would actually work. And the backup direct impact warhead didn't work either. And the depth keeping device didn't work either. So there were three problems with the Mark 14 and as well as the subsequent Mark 15. The 14 was for submarines and the 15 for surface ships. It would take the United States about 3 years in World War II to figure this out. There's a lovely YouTube video on that. You can see it below on labeled after the Mark 14 torpedo there. Just consider the effect of Admiral King, who was known as, he had one mood, angry. And when he got mad, this is finally when the 14 was fixed. Guided torpedoes, they also looked at them. The Germans were using a torpedo that would run in a pattern and a torpedo that would run with radio control. The interesting story for the radio-controlled torpedo was that some of the Germans' naval officers went to a party thrown by an Austrian arms manufacturer named Mandel after the Anschluss. And at the party was Mandel's wife, who was a beautiful woman. She looked like a nice ornament. So the naval officers were bragging to her that they had this torpedo that they could guide, and there was no way anybody could interfere with it. Frau Mandel was not just a pretty woman. She was actually a self-trained engineer. Since she was Jewish, she did not like the Germans very much, and she packed up all her jewels, left, came to the United States, worked on the program to understand how a guided torpedo could be done, how you could make an unjammable technique, and then patented it. It's called frequency hopping. It is how your cell phones work today. Mrs. Mandel was so grateful to the United States, she assigned the patent to the U.S. Navy. It makes quite a story. So in World War II, early torpedoes finally get used for what they were first designed for, which was harbor defense. Virtually every major harbor in Europe and a few in the United States had forts built with underwater torpedo tubes. You can still see some of these in Norway and Malta and Britain. And it was only actually used once when the Germans invade Norway in 1940. And during the Battle of Drøbak Sound, the lead German ship, a heavy cruiser named Blücher, sails by the Oscarborg Fortress, which is at the Narrows. The Narrows are only about 300 yards wide. And at the Narrows, the Norwegians have recalled a retired colonel, and he runs around in the fortress with his crew of amateurs. He has enough to load one and fire one gun. So they load one gun, then they move to the other gun, they load that, and they wait for the Blücher to sail in front of them, and then he shoots her with the first gun, then he shoots her with the second, 2 hits. And as the Blücher's now out of control, his torpedo officer puts 2 torpedoes in. All these are 1898 Austrian manufactured guns, shells, and torpedoes. And the Blucher goes down in Drobig Sound, fortunately taking with her the entire SS contingent that was supposed to sail into Oslo, capture the king and the parliament, as well as the Norwegian gold supplies. They all successfully escape. Torpedoes are used extensively, of course, and the attack at Pearl Harbor is preceded by the British attack at Toronto, which should have given us fair warning. Toronto is a bit deeper harbor down at the heel of Italy, and they fire 11 torpedo-carrying swordfish, which is an old, slow biplane. It was absolutely obsolete. But they fly in at night, and they get 5 hits, hit 3 battleships. One of them never recovers, is never repaired. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese will fix the problem of shallow water by putting a little box structure on the tail end of their torpedoes. Now, it's not perfect. A third of their torpedoes still hit the bottom and were recovered later by the Navy. But the ones that did get through, you have 19 hits on our battleships, 9 to 11 of them on the Oklahoma, because the Japanese weren't quite as experienced as you might think. The setup of Pearl Harbor coming in on that side tended to channel the incoming torpedo craft towards one ship, and that was the Oklahoma, was dead ahead. They didn't spread out. They could have actually rendered 4 battleships completely inoperable. Instead, the others only took a few hits, although California and Nevada sink with a single hit. It's because nobody closed the watertight doors, and the ones that were closed had been painted over, so they still leaked. Maximum torpedoes in a battle in World War II. My best guess for this is Java Sea. The Japanese opened the battle at 25,000 yards, which is beyond their range of their torpedoes. And Japanese doctrine says you volley off all your torpedoes early on, knock out enough of the enemy that you'll cripple them. They fire 92 torpedoes at the ABDA line, which has 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers. And they get 1 hit, and it's only on a destroyer that is actually not in line. It's several thousand yards in front, but it's 22,000 yards away. And the Type 93 just blows it in half. The ABDA line fires 32 torpedoes at the Japanese, and they get no hits. Then the Japs are able to close. They fire 80 torpedoes, and this time they get 2 hits. So while it's a lethal weapon, it's not nearly as accurate as it's sometimes advertised. The other encounter would be the Battle of Tassafaronga, which is one of the greatest American defeats in goat ropes of the whole war. They gave the American commander a medal and then sent him home, never let him on a ship again, because he ignored his radar warning. They could have surprised a Japanese reinforcement fleet. Instead, they sail past, then they shoot at a single destroyer, and the entire Japanese line opens up on the Americans, sinking 1 cruiser, crippling 3. You can see the USS Minneapolis there had her entire bow blown away. If the torpedo had hit about 10 feet further back, she would have gone down as well. Too late, the admiral told his destroyers to shoot. They were out of range. They got no hits. The submarine warfare is now unrestricted warfare at this point. Nobody's going to argue with Woodrow Wilson. And in the Atlantic, the German and Italians will sink 3,000 ships, about 12 million tons of shipping. Here's the high score, 38. Compare that to the Great War. In the Pacific, the United States will sink 1,392 ships, 5.5 million tons of shipping. And our high score is the USS Tang with 33 ships, 34 if you count the Tang, because she sank herself. There was a circular running torpedo that unfortunately hit the Tang and took her down. Only 11 of her crew managed to survive, including Captain Tang. O'Kane. So the Japanese sort of carried this to the ultimate. Here's the ultimate torpedo carrying ship, a cruiser converted to carry 40 torpedoes per launch and then reload it. And these torpedoes have range, 23,000 yards. Often the Americans would take a hit, and we had no idea where the torpedo came from. It was thought that a submarine would be stalking our ships while the enemy cruisers were far out of torpedo range, because the Japanese couldn't possibly have a torpedo that would shoot 4 times as far as ours. We learned the hard way. Some manned torpedoes were invented. The Italian Mele, again, I'm butchering that, I'm sorry, which is actually a chariot. They would come up against an enemy warship. The forward end of the torpedo here is detached as a mine and then set off. It's fairly successful. They sank 2 British battleships in Alexandria Harbor. The Japanese converted their long length into a manned torpedo, basically a kamikaze torpedo, the K-10. They have one success. It has to be carried to near its target by a mother submarine, and they had these very large 6,000-ton I-class submarines, and they managed to carry one to a refueling atoll, Ulithi, release one of them, which sank a American tanker in the anchorage. That was their only success. This is the greatest torpedo volley in history. You have a Japanese submarine, the I-19, fires 6 torpedoes, gets 5 or 6 hits. We don't know how many the Hornet was hit by. She was quite close to the I-19. 2 torpedoes went past the Hornet, missed 2 other ships. 10,000 yards later, they hit the USS O'Brien, which has no idea what's going on because nobody warns her. And then 10,000 yards past that, another torpedo hits the USS North Carolina. This is a point where the United States gets a clue that maybe the Japanese have a good torpedo. Since North Carolina is 20,000 yards from the Hornet, and the damage to the North Carolina is incredibly large compared to any torpedo the United States had. And they will use that. The North Carolina survives because of a torpedo bulge. This is a compartment attached to the outside of warships, generally all the battleships, some of the cruiser. It's just simply an empty compartment. It'll be open to the sea, so there'll be some water in there, air in there, and it will cause the torpedo to detonate before it hits the hull. No warship in World War I had this, although a couple cruisers were built by the British to do it. Notably, they used a monitor, one of those very shallow draft ships designed to go inshore. And it worked quite well because one of their monitors caught fire in Portsmouth Harbor, and they were afraid the magazine would go up, so they had to torpedo their own ship. The torpedo bulge worked so well that they kept coming back, firing torpedoes at it until they got one to go through the hull from the previous torpedo. That finally sank their own ship in harbor. After World War II, the torpedo sort of drops out of fashion. There's not much major warfare at sea, although the Navy manages to blow up a dam using torpedoes during the Korean War. There's an encounter between a Pakistani submarine that sinks an Indian frigate in 1971. We're all aware of the HMS Conqueror sinking Belgrano, which is the ex-USS Phoenix, a light cruiser. And he used a World War II torpedo rather than trying out one of the wire-guided new torpedoes that they didn't trust. The Kursk sank herself in 2000 when an experimental peroxide fuel torpedo blew up in the ship. We don't know if the USS Scorpion may have been sunk by her own runaway torpedo. That's the leading theory for the loss of that vessel. And 10 years ago, the North Koreans decided to sink a corvette, a small patrol boat, with a torpedo. Now, back to our torpedo. This is the museum's torpedo today. Notice it has a pointed nose. And I did tell you, torpedoes have blunt noses. Our nose that we have on the torpedo is actually the practice nose. It would be filled with water and used to shoot the torpedo in practice runs. You simply charged up the gas container up to 1800 psi and took a practice shot. Once the torpedo had got to the end of its run, it was now lighter than it had been, and it would float to the surface. You could recover it and use it again. So many of these old compressed air torpedoes were fired multiple times. The document you see there is a document in our archives demonstrating that our torpedo was donated in 1926 by the commanding admiral, Admiral Block. I don't know if he's related to Henry and Richard Block of Kansas City, but it's quite possible. Our torpedo is a Whitehead Mark I Type B. It was made at this facility in Brooklyn, New York, the E.W. Bliss Company. We had a contract to build 100 Whitehead torpedoes under license. Our torpedo is number 69. It was only used on surface ships, either a torpedo boat or a torpedo boat destroyer. It's a Type B because it had a 20% longer compressed air compartment. That canister, which was purchased from Whitehead Company and sent to New York. It had a warhead of 220 pounds of gun cotton. Again, it's not TNT, it's gun cotton. And the range, it has an increased range because of the extra air counter, so it has a range of about 1,000 yards at 27 knots, which is a pretty decent speed. But this is not nearly comparable to the Japanese Long Lance, which was an oxygen-fueled torpedo, range of 20,000 yards or more. That kill at Java Sea was 22,000 yards. It does not have TNT. So the label on our torpedo is not exactly correct. The label talks about typical torpedoes, I think, but it would not actually address our torpedo here because it didn't carry TNT and its range was far less than 13,000 yards. So Bliss manufactured 100 of these torpedoes, and then they began manufacturing their own, some for submarines and some for surface ships. As I said, ours is number 69. I've contacted the United States National Archives, and the documents that describe the whole history of this torpedo from when it was in use, from 1898 when it was manufactured, until it was withdrawn, which was probably around 1920. And it went into storage at the Bureau of Ordnance. And in 1925, since it was surplus, the Bureau of Ordnance donated it to the museum. It didn't give us the real warhead. They gave us the practice warhead. In the documents at National Archives, I have not got in there yet, but I'm going to. They won't send them here to the archives in Kansas City. I'm going to have to wait for my next trip to Washington, D.C., but they know which box it's in, and I'm going to find out the whole history of this torpedo from when the Navy received it until they gave it to the museum. If you look at our torpedo, the technical details, one item on the top is this guide projection. This is actually a slot in the torpedo tube that the torpedo is pushed forward until it hits the stop. Then a second stop is lowered behind it. That locks the torpedo in place. and you can't fire the torpedo until the forward stop is removed. It also has the advantage of making sure that when the torpedo is fired, that it is upright. It has to have a definite vertical axis to it, because inside the torpedo is a pendulum for depth keeping. And if the torpedo starts to roll more than 45 degrees, the pendulum is going to sense its depth is incorrect, and the corrections will be made not in depth, but in azimuth. And that's how you get a circular run. Your torpedo has rolled 45 degrees or more, and now the torpedo thinks it's at the wrong depth and keeps trying to steer. On the back of the torpedo, in the aft compartment, there are exhaust ports for the compressed air. That's why we get a bubble trail from this torpedo and all other torpedoes except the oxygen ones, which they burn so efficiently there's no exhaust, and in electric torpedoes. The rudders on our torpedo have to be preset for azimuth. So you got to aim it before you shoot it. It doesn't correct. It does have counter-rotating props, and the horizontal rudder is for depth correction. Inside the torpedo, this is a cross-section from the actual torpedo manual. The compressed air, there's a forward compartment, gun cotton warhead with this funny-looking device at the very tip that spins and arms the torpedo. So it has to go several hundred yards before the torpedo is armed, and then the little fins there also are impactors, so that's what will trigger the warhead. In the middle is the air flask. We have the long torpedo. The original Whitehead is a bit shorter and shorter range. There's a turbine for the air to spin as it comes out. That will then in turn run the rudders. The pendulum is here for depth keeping. So the torpedo actually has to have a definite up and down to it. It can't just fire it at any angle. A gyro stabilizer was probably added at some point, but for some reason the staff won't let me tear the torpedo open and take a look. So in summary, torpedoes changed the entire nature of naval warfare. Prior to torpedoes being widespread, major vessels fought in a line of battle. Straight lines, slug it out, whoever has the most hits and the most resistance is going to win. Can't do this anymore because torpedoes fired at you, you have to turn away. That is naval doctrine then, it's still naval doctrine now. When the submarine comes along, it actually has a weapon to use. And this changes the nature of commerce war and naval blockades. And finally, with the aircraft, it changes the entire nature and range of naval warfare. We're no longer within sight of our opponent. We can reach out and touch them. Now, I've not attempted to really deal in depth with naval battles in the First World War, although you can see how the torpedo affected the Great War in every aspect of naval operations and ultimately how the blockade affected the end of the war. If you want to go to the whole history, we have online Doug Darling's video of the Kaiserlich Marine, which is most but not all the Austrians, the Russians, and the British, and the Italians and the French also have major navies, major naval engagements throughout the war. Like I said, there were over 100 surface actions. Jutland is just the biggest one. So thanks for listening. A few references here if you need them. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Very good, Al. That's if anybody has a question, just unmute or raise your hand, and we'll listen to it. But I have one question for you. You mentioned that they used oxygen in the torpedoes, but then you said that they didn't actually have any gas discharge from the oxygen torpedoes.
Yeah.
But that means the oxygen had to be combined with some sort of fuel
Correct.
so that they could burn. So what they actually use?
The Japanese were using alcohol, and they would burn it, but the hot combustion gases are so diffuse that they don't really leave a trail. Most of the bubbles in a trail come from the nitrogen because that's 80% of the gas available. When you burn air, yeah, there is some combustion gas, primarily carbon dioxide, which is highly soluble in water. So we don't get much carbon dioxide coming to the surface, whereas nitrogen is virtually, that's not completely insoluble, but it has a very low solubility. For those of us dealing with barometric issues in scuba divers and high altitude pilots, the nitrogen's the problem, not carbon dioxide. And even when carbon dioxide's in the water, it quickly dissolves in the water and then dissociates.
Well, that's the same thing with oxygen and air. When you use air in your internal combustion engine, most of what comes out of the tailpipe is going to be nitrogen.
Correct.
And
And
you
steam.
expose nitrogen to high temperature, and you get nitrogen compounds, which may or may not be nice things to have up in the atmosphere. But if you used oxygen, then the fuel would pretty much use up all the oxygen so that you wouldn't get any discharge.
That's correct. So there's very little discharge when you're burning 100% oxygen. And what comes out are hot, highly soluble gases. The oxides of nitrogen are pretty nasty, which is why we have catalytic converters.
Indeed we do. All right. Anybody else have any thoughts or questions?
Modern torpedoes are almost all homing devices. So they will have a sensor, either an active sensor for sonar. They could have a passive sensor, and those were introduced in World War II. And many torpedoes are wire guided, much like a tow missile, an anti-tank missile. So these torpedoes are guided, and virtually every modern torpedo has some sort of guidance, except nuclear torpedoes, which, like hand grenades, you only have to get so close.
It's hard to carry enough wire to guide a nuclear torpedo.
Well, you want to have a lot of distance between you.
Yeah, it would take a number of miles. Let's just say that. Although with the wire-guided torpedoes, I think their current range is in the neighborhood of a couple of miles.
Yeah, so they're all over 20,000 yards at this point, and many of them are actually rocket launched. Some of the modern ones will vertical launch in our submarines, carry out to the approximate target location, and then drop the torpedo in, and it begins its homing mission at that point, which is now far enough away that it doesn't home in on you.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for listening. We will be we have recorded this, and we will be in due course processing this to get it up onto YouTube. This was a very nice lecture, and Al, I guess we're all grateful to that visit you made a long time ago with Torpedo to promote your interest in this. Thank you again for all the preparation and work and for giving us a really, really good lecture. Well, again, thank you all for attending, and everybody have a good evening.